All right, let's start the recording here. I think it's working. Yep, seems like it's recording. So let's get started and see how this goes today. So my name is Steve Jones, and this is the live Stairways, where I'm actually working through some DAX and Power BI, working through the particular stairway that's on the screen right now, trying to better understand how DAX works and how I can use it to analyze data. I've never been a strong DAX user. I really haven't used it very much, or analysis services. So this is my chance to kind of grow some knowledge with these live stairways. Now they are live. You can join them and move forward. I haven't promoted them too heavily just because I'm struggling to work through some of these things and trying to figure out how this works. But if you do want to join into future ones, look for the live stairways, either for this course, which is being recorded, or for future courses that we'll be doing. So today's level two. Level two is the DAX count rows and filter functions. I think this is enough to go through about 30 or 45 minutes of things, but we'll see how it goes. One note, I did install analysis services after class one, and so I will post some blogs on how to do that, how I added that to my installation. But that is something that we will want to do at some point. We don't need it for today, so I'm not going to show it, but I did add that in, and I'll add that as a homework item. The other one thing I want to note is I did kind of flip through the stairway and read it because I didn't want to be reading it live while there were people here, but you know, I haven't done any of the exercises, so we'll go through those now. A couple of things that are going on. I do have Power BI running. So here is the Power BI desktop that we set up last time. So you'll see over here on the right-hand side, the various dimensions and fact tables that were added from level one. So those are available here, and we're going to use those into part of this session. So with that, let's get going. So I do see I got Robert here. So welcome, Robert. Hopefully you enjoy this and go through it. So the first part is there's this import section here that Bill has written about in Power Pivot in Excel. Now we're not using Excel here. We're going to use Power BI, but this is very similar to what we did in level one. So all of the items that are listed here, all of these tables that are listed are the ones that are actually imported into Power BI over here. And if we pick this middle icon on the left, that's data, then we can actually see some of these. So one of the items I think is the DIM product subcategory. So you can see there's a number of items in here as well. So we can actually look at the data there if we want to verify anything that's listed here. Since I've imported those, we're going to skip this and we're going to go down to the count rows function. So one of the things that I'm seeing in DAX is that it's very much functionally driven, and that some of these functions work on tables and some of these don't. So in this case, the count rows function is something that we do often. Many of us are used to doing count in SQL. And so this is actually working on a table or an expression that returns a table. So it seems like most of the functions that I've lightly played with in DAX do return tables. So here in this case, we'll see what this does. And it's a fairly simple function, right? I give it a table and an expression in here. For example, count rows for this particular table, DIM product category. And it says it would return 4. Well, that's interesting. I wonder if that's true. Let me go over here and say in SQL, count star from DIM product category, I think it is, right? Is that right? DIM product category. And what do we get? We get 4. So I would assume that if we use the same function in DAX, that's exactly what we're going to get 4. So let's try that very quickly. Hopefully I've learned something here. So DIM product category. Oh, was that not added? Was that one of them? I think we didn't add that in table 1, though. I would have thought it would have come in. DIM product category is there, but I don't have a DIM product category here. Let's actually see if we remember something from the last time. So we'll say here, oh, that's not what I wanted, home, get data, and we're going to go to SQL Server again. So I'll pick my local instance here. I'm doing this in 2017, and I'm not going to try to type the syntax for AdventureWorks. This should tell me that we want the data warehouse. dim product category. So let's add just this one table to our system. So I should see that here. It's loading. And then I have dim product category. So if I were to add a new column here, let's try this. And we'll say count rows for dim product category. Now this returns a scalar value, which I assume then would populate through all 4 of these. And let's see if that happens. So I do get a 4 there. Now I have seen some people do presentations on DAX, and there are places where they do want the scalar values to appear, and so they'll actually put them into various tables, columns, sets of data. So there is value there. Off the top of my head, I don't see why I want that for that table, but it's just an experiment for me. So one of the first things we want to do is we want to add I think he's just practicing here. Oh, excuse me. So we're going to add a column to dim subproduct category. So it's similar to what I just did. We are going to insert the function for count rows. And what will that give us? So it's going to give us in the same table this count. So let's just do that for dim subproduct category. Or product subcategory rather, sorry. So in this case, we'll do the same type of thing, working through Bill's exercise as well as my own. So we'll say count rows. You see IntelliSense works, so I have all of these functions that I can choose. We'll do count rows, counts the number of rows in the table, and dim product subcategory. And we're counting the entire table here. And then is there a name? We're going to call it no rows here is what we're going to go through. So let's call it no rows. I don't know if I need brackets or quotes there. Let's see what happens. Oh, that seems to work. I get an error, of course, because I did something wrong. So it's a column reference as a... Oh, sorry, I did count, not count rows. There we go. Let's see if that works. And so this is created. It has a no rows 37, which looks correct. I don't actually need the brackets here or quotes. I can actually just type, and Power BI is figuring out, or DAX is figuring out what I actually want there. So that's good to know. Unlike SQL, where identifiers have to be, you know, quoted or they have to be marked off. I don't have to do that here. So that's kind of an interesting thing to learn here. Now, what do we want to do? So we're going to click on dim sales territory, add a column there. And we'll do the same thing. Dim sales territory. And it'll give us a name. And it wants it to be no rows again. So let's see. Let's do that. I'm not sure where he's going to use these, but we'll follow along with Bill here and do this. So no rows equals count rows for dim sales territory. And I'm just going to hit enter because I like keyboard shortcuts. You notice I didn't proper case anything here. And of course I didn't do something correctly here. Not sure what I did wrong there, but let's delete whatever this is here. Let's go back to dim sales territory. I think I didn't click something going a little too fast, which should be a lesson to me. I should be better at this. A new column. So Power BI is slightly slow sometimes. That's not what I want. No rows equals count rows, dim sales territory. Now, IntelliSense should work pretty well when I've seen it demoed. So it's possible that there's times where I'm going too fast and I don't notice the IntelliSense there, but I should notice it because that's often been a clue to me that something is working or not working. So we've got 11. That's correct. It's renamed to no rows. So we're fine. All right. So count rows seems to make sense to me that we're getting a scalar value back from a table of some sort. I do know, and I have heard that one of the things people do often is they're filtering things. So in Power BI, as I work with visualizations and I click on certain items, filters are automatically applied to the data sets. So filters become an important part of what we're doing. So in this case, there is actually a filter function, and I've never used it. I've actually never written code with the filter function. So this is will be interesting to me. Now, filter is a place where we reduce the number of rows or we narrow a data set. And that certainly is something that I think I've often had to do where I'm trying to use a where clause to filter things down and then perform an analysis on just those particular items. So in this case, let's see what this says. So the filter function, which I assume we're going to use in count rows because filter should return a table back. So we can use that as an input to the count rows function. We put in a table and then a filter. And so what does the filter mean? The filter here is some sort of expressions. So it looks like there's some sort of Boolean type expression here, or equality expression. So I'm given a column equals some value or greater than, less than. So I assume all the typical operators that we would normally use in a where clause would apply here. And then you can see that this entire parameter to count rows is the filter function. So that's interesting, right? That should do something. So 5 rows in dim sales territory with United States. Well, let's check that. So if I said sales territory country equals United States, and let's see what I get back here. So dim sales territory where, let's clean up the syntax here for SQL. And I get 5 back. And in fact, if I were to, sometimes I like to double check the data if there's not a lot there. What do I get here? So the first 5 keys here are North America, United States. There are other items in there though. So you can see there's in fact 11 total. So we're filtering out the non-US items here. So the interesting thing in this level 2 is that Bill doesn't kind of combine the actual work with the practice. He's got them in separate sections. So as you go through, let's see what we say here now. So we're going to click dim sales territory. We're going to add a column, which I assume is going to be that function. So we'll select count rows, and then we're going to do filter. And then we're going to do where United States equals, yeah, that's what it's going to do. So let's do that. So dim sales territory. And once again, we'll say new column. And I'm going to get a new column here. And now what I'm going to do is I'll put that in there. And that wasn't what I wanted, but that's okay. So let's do count rows. And we'll say filter and dim sales territory, comma, dim sales territory country equals United States. And I do believe I need the double quotes, but let's see if I do single quotes, what does that actually mean? Because I work in T-SQL all the time and I'm so used to using single quotes. And so if I don't have to remember to change, that's always nice. Some languages I don't have to change, some I do. So in this case, it does appear that I need to use double quotes, which I think I use double quotes in PowerShell a lot already, so this isn't the end of the world. All right, so this looks somewhat valid now. So column, count rows, filter. It added back my other parentheses, which I had taken off. So you can see that that seems to work. So I've got 11 rows and 5, which is what I expect I should see. So I should see 5, and we'll call no US rows. Oh, number US rows, I assume. I think that's poorly named on Bill's part, but we'll leave that alone. No US number US rows. That is going to make me slightly crazy. So I am a big standards type person, and I think naming matters. Naming conveys a lot of information. I would think no is a poor choice of naming here. I think if I were actually physically doing this in a item for users to use, I would change it to num, not no, because to me, no would imply that this would not be US rows. But in any case, I'm going to leave it alone because that's what the stairway does. And so if we're looking for this later on, we're actually going to want to have the same thing there. So hopefully that makes sense. All right. So we've gotten through count rows and filter, and I think it's a basic idea of what those things entail, what those functions actually mean from the DAX perspective. Some of the differences certainly are having to do the quotes, not having to qualify this column name here in any way is kind of interesting. So now calculated columns and calculated measures. Now we did some calculated columns in level 1. We had the chance to create one of those. In this case, the level is looking at a pivot table. A pivot table is a way of filtering out data. I think Power BI inherently does that when you put a table on your visualization, but let's see how that actually works. So in this case, it's saying a new worksheet and create a pivot table, which I'm not going to worry about for this time being. I'm actually going to try to do this in the visualization and see if I can make this work. These are the various fields that you may put in there, and these items appear. If I go back to my visualization and we actually look through some of these, so dim sales territory, number of rows, number of US rows, both appear here, and I'm remembering that it's number, not no. So those are items that we can actually stick in a table. So if I were to come over here and pick table, I could drag this over here, and I would see no rows and no US rows. And I'm actually getting a number here that I wouldn't expect. I'm getting 121 and 55, whereas in the data, we were getting those as 11 and 5, okay? And so that's an interesting thing. And Bill talks about that later on because I did read through this. And so that's one of the items that we'll think about. So in this case, it's saying we can add a new measure, which I'm not 100% positive I understand technically exactly how the measures and the columns work. I know the measures work in a different section of things, whereas a column is for the entire table. So the measure is for part of that. So in this case, we're going to create this measure, CM underbar number of rows, and we're going to use it under dim sales territory. So the table, the measure that we're going to create. And what we're going to do is we're going to count dim sales territory, and that's it, number of rows. Okay, so let's try that. So dim sales territory, let's do a new measure, and we'll create the items here. All right, so the measure name is going to be CM under number of rows. So CM under I thought maybe that we couldn't have spaces in the measure name, but apparently we can. So we're going to do count rows, and dim sales territory is what we're going to do. Sales territory. And that was the only part of this function. So we're closing the function and click OK, and it's going to appear. as a new measure, and it appears over here on the right-hand side. If I drag that to my table, now I see the 11 that I kind of expected in this table visualization. Let me move this around slightly. So why is that? Why do we only see 11? We're going to do it again. So we're going to do, I assume this is calculated measure, number of US rows, and we're going to do the same filter function we did before. This goes a lot quicker if I've gone through it once. So we'll do sales total equals US, I assume, equals, quotes, United States. All right, so let's make another new measure and let's see this, which I assume will give me the 5 that I expect already. So calculate measure number of US rows, which I believe is what there's there. Yes. Count rows, filter, dim sales territory. If I can do this from memory. I do like that it's grabbing my end parentheses and let me know where it matches up, because these functions do get complex. And number of US rows, 5. So interesting. So 55 to 5, 121 to 11. So we've got this column we added, and then we've got this measure that we've added. And so when I looked through this before, what I actually see is there is a section here, calculated column versus calculated measures. So how do we decide what we're actually doing here, what the differences are? He's talking about pivot tables, but he's saying that the calculated measure operates on aggregations below the pivot table or underneath the DAX evaluation context. So it works on aggregations based on where we are in the data itself or the cell, or in the table, I assume. So calculated column, it says that the calculation is a current row. So that's interesting. I'm not sure that I completely understand the difference here. I think experimenting with different values will help. So calculated columns are nice when we want a slicer, some sort of external filter essentially is what we're doing here, or we want to see results of calculations across in rows or columns, grouping. The measure is when we want to place the results in the values section. So that's, the values section is kind of like the individual data here. And this is, how do I explain it? The column is more, it is the whole data there. Now, when Bill talks about this, he says the reason we see different things is there's, in essence, a bit of double counting that's occurring here. So I'm sure you could figure out the value for the 121 here as well. But in this case, what's happening is the 5 US rows are kind of being summed across the 11 total rows to give me 55. So that's what's really happening there, that we're getting this double counting measure. So in this sense, the sum of non-US rows is 55 because the calculated column returns 5 for each of the 11 rows, right? So I think what makes sense here is that we have 5 being returned here, and in the table, we're summing up this entire value, this entire column. And because there's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, up to 55, that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing double counting because, like a pivot table, Power BI is actually summing these things out when we use them here, which makes sense, right? So if I were to look at this in SQL and I did a sum of this count, I would get 55 as well, because I've actually added this value for every row in the table. I've actually added this additional data in a column. So I have to be very careful about how I use this data across rows in the column. So that's interesting. I think that starts to make some sense, but I do think it could be really easy to get into trouble if you're adding columns and not measures to your table when your columns are returning scalars and summing things up. So that's interesting. Now, I think that's enough to look at for today. When I look through level three actually has distinct and some other items. It isn't terribly long here, but there are a few items to go through. So I'm going to skip that. And I think what I'll end up doing is combining level 3 and level 4 later on. But for today, we went through level 2. Let me just find level 2 here. And I think the big things I covered today briefly are that we have the count rows and filter and how we use that together. And I assume as we move forward in new functions, we will use filter fairly extensively. The demo presentations that I've seen from Bill, what I've seen from Razor Rad and some others use filter fairly extensively. And Power BI has some own internal filtering that it occurs when you pick values. So I think that we'll start to use that more and more. Count rows, I think, is a function that I'd be careful about using as a column level item because that double counting will occur. And then where we use a measure versus a column is probably an interesting thing to better understand. I'm not 100% sure about where I'd use each one right now, but I'm hoping that as I continue to go through the various levels, we find different places where a column or a measure just inherently makes more sense in terms of performing some data analysis, especially when we get into slicers. As a matter of fact, let's do one more thing here with slicers. So I've got this table. Let's say I wanted to do some sort of visualization here. So now I don't really want a stacked one. I want individual ones. So I've got these different values in here, and then let's add a slicer. And which one is country? My tooltip is slow to pop up. Let's do this. So if I pick United States, what happens? 5, 5, 25. So my values change, right? My US rows and my non-US rows change if I pick United States because it inherently is adding a filter. So the number of rows total is filtered down to United States. Of course, the number of United States rows remains the same, and these change in terms of the sum of some items. If I were to pick something else, let's say France, you'll notice that the number of rows is 1, which makes perfect sense to me. In terms of my data, there is in fact one row that says France. And the number of US rows is 0. That has dropped out of the display because the filter that's being applied by this slicer has removed the rows from the visualization. And this is where the power of Power BI, I think, comes into play, that users don't have to rewrite queries. They don't have to do some of the other things you might have to do in reporting. They can quickly do this. You can do this in Excel pivot tables, but I think for visualizations, this is inherently easier and quicker for many non-technical people to understand. So this, I think, is somewhat fascinating. The other interesting point, which I meant to put in here, let's try this. Let me create a new table here. So we'll create table Steve test, ID and country. So we create a table here. Okay. Now, inherently right now, this has no data in it, right? There's nothing in there, so no rows of data. Let me create one more. Test 1, and we'll do this. And now in this case, I want to insert Steve test 1. So this was something I just happened to catch in the reading really quickly, and I meant to point it out, but I didn't do it. So now I have two tables here. one of these has no data, one of these has one row of data. So let's import those back into Power BI and let's check something. So we'll get data. I have to go get these because I don't have a live connection per se here. 2017, and again, I'm not typing the database name because I'll mistype it somewhere. And so I've got Steve test and Steve test 1. So let's load these. So we're going to load these into our data model, and we now have these 2 additional tables in there. All right, so once these are done, I'm just going to pick on my sales territory item here. So I'm going to say a new column, just because I can. And so we're going to go Steve 1, the count rows of Steve test 1. Okay. So we're going to put that in there. And actually, I want to do this in the data model, not in the visualization section. So there's 1 row in that table, correct? That's what I just did in here. Let's shrink this down so I can see a little better. For my first table, there's no rows. And for my Steve test 1, there's 1 row of data. So count rows returns 1. And that makes perfect sense. So let me now, I am on sales territory. Let's add 1 new column. And we're going to call this Steve equals count rows. So my first table now, this one has no data in it. So what would you expect to return here in terms of this value? In SQL, count returns a numeric. So I would expect a 0 to return here because there's no data in there. Well, in the writing, it actually says that if there's no data, it returns a blank, which I think is fascinating from a few levels. I think it starts to make sense in visualization, but it returns a blank. On the other hand, if I was applying a filter somehow that didn't match any rows, then I would return a 0, which I think is, I'm not sure if I think it's correct, but I do think it's one of those items that you should be aware of. So I believe that Bill does talk about that. So count rows return a blank when there are no rows to count, but a 0 when there are rows, but none of them fit the criteria. So that's one of those items I think becomes important for you to understand. And it almost feels like this is a magic piece of knowledge in the count rows function. Maybe I'll feel differently as I use Power BI over time, but for now I find that that's a little bit strange and unusual. So I think I'm going to stop there. Next time we'll go over levels 3 and 4. Any questions out there at all from anybody? I've only got a couple people, but I don't see anything popping up. So with that, I will call this a day. So hopefully you've enjoyed this, you've learned something. And then if you've got additional questions, we do have the area on the hub. There's some forums that are linked there. You can ask questions in the future, and then we'll move forward from there. So thanks very much, and have a great day and enjoy.